What Have You Done For Me Lately isn't just a fantastic Janet Jackson hit from the 1980s. We see this focus on recent rewards in politics too, and part of the reason is because voters usually can't remember what happened more than a year ago. But since voters often want bad policies enacted, like trade restrictions and heavy-handed labor market regulation, the short-term memory problems that plague voters create a window of opportunity for good policy. What makes politicians more likely to support the expert consensus on issues like freer trade and lower import tariffs? For some answers, let's turn to evidence from the United States Congress. While U.S. senators have 6-year terms, members of the lower house of the legislature, the U.S. House of Representatives, have just 2-year terms. What encourages senators to vote for lower trade barriers? One big factor, being years away from re-election. When a senator is in cycle, in other words, when the re-election campaign is less than 2 years away, she's 10 percentage points less likely to vote for a freer trade deal. Economist Paula Conconi established this fact in an aptly subtitled 2014 paper, The Protectionist Effect of Elections. She provides anecdotal evidence for her case in a footnote. She says, for example, during her first term as senator from New York State, Hillary Clinton voted on 6 trade liberalization bills, 4 times in favor during the first 4 years, and twice against during the last 2 years, just before she was ready for re-election. Politicians act differently when the election looms. They don't just show up to more county fairs and more church services. They're also more reluctant to support one policy reform that experts agree upon: freer international trade. Conconi's creative study packs a lot of power because it compares in-cycle senators to 2 very different groups: out-of-cycle senators and House members, and every method yields consistent results. When elections are looming, U.S. politicians are less likely to support a policy that most economists would support. It's politics all the way down, and short-term swing state politics at that. Calm and cool planning for the economy's long-run prosperity, this is not. It appears that looming elections are bad news for good economics. This isn't just a story that applies to the United States, however. On average, the story that looming elections lead to bad economic policy holds around the world. The best evidence comes from a study of IMF programs co-authored by Stephanie Ricard of the London School of Economics. When the International Monetary Fund offers loan and aid packages to developing countries, often just after a financial crisis, these packages often come with strings attached. One set of strings: labor market reforms, demands that a nation lower the minimum wage, make it easier to fire workers, and make other related changes that many citizens will oppose. As with international trade, labor market policy is an area where economists tend to agree with each other and tend to disagree with the general public. So how do looming elections fit into this? Ricard and Caraway checked to see if the supposedly all-powerful IMF imposed fewer labor market liberalization reforms when there was an election looming. Financial crises are somewhat random, so if they happen when elections are years away, does the IMF demand lots of pie-growing, productivity-increasing reforms? When a financial crisis occurs just before a scheduled election, does the IMF wimp out and demand fewer pie-growing reforms? Ricard and Caraway report, drawing on a total of 297 different IMF interventions in democracies the world over. In their words, labor conditions included in programs signed within 6 months of an upcoming election are, on average, 50% less stringent than those agreed more than 6 months away from elections. It turns out that the IMF behaves a lot like many U.S. senators. The fund is reluctant to push for reforms that are relatively popular with experts, but unpopular with voters. Both politicians and international lending agencies have limits to their political bravery, and an election year isn't the best time to ask either one to ignore the demands of the voters. This means that if elections were a little less frequent, for instance, if political terms of 2 or 3 years were lengthened to 4 or 6 years, politicians would find political bravery a little easier to come by. The world's rich democracies would likely stand a better chance of getting better economic policies, and we'd all still feel like we lived in democracies.
If you want to learn more about public choice, check out some of our other videos